Chapter 7, 2184. The next day, Dixie tossed his English paper into a municipal city trash can in frustration as he sat by the bus stop. His car had been towed back from the auto shop and onto his driveway, completely inoperable. Even worse, the tow truck guy didn't have any space to seat him. Fidgeting, Dixie reached into the trash can and looked at his written assignment once again. It was supposed to be an essay on the novel they had read in class, called 2184, followed by commentary on how its predictions on society held up with modern times. Dixie hadn't heard the directions properly. Too many run-on sentences, he muttered. That's what his English professor had written. There were also some other corrections at the bottom of Dixie's paper. Too vague. Follow directions. Describe what exact solutions will be offered that year. How can you prove any of this? References, works cited, etc., etc., etc. And in big bold letters at the bottom, D+. I'm not redoing it. I'm not doing any of this, Dixie thought to himself. I'm only going to get 2-point scale, even if I bother. What difference is it going to make? Frustrated, he let his mind wander and think about the visions he had been experiencing. He had experienced another one this morning, actually. Eyes wide open while he ate a bowl of cereal. In this one, he saw his wheelchaired grandfather sitting on the edge of a dock and tossing a tennis ball into a lake, while Dixie could see himself jumping in the lake and fetching it like a wet dog. Last night, he had a cool one, though, right before bed. It's a really strange vision. Something about ancient Aztec pyramids and then caverns with jacuzzis with multicolored waters inside of them. What does it all mean, he wondered. Am I really going crazy? He was terrified of bombarding his parents with a triple whammy of bad news that might be too much for them. They had learned about the car 2 nights ago, right after they had heard from Mrs. Edwinson, their neighbor, how she hadn't seen Dixie at work for a few days. Is he ill? She had asked them. Now Dixie was going to have to contrive another excuse and convince him that maybe he was ill after all. Perfect excuse, at least, for getting fired. But deep down, he hoped he wasn't. Trying to stay optimistic, he had been trying to convince himself the visions were all interconnected somehow. As he waited by the bus stop, he let his mind continue its course into oblivion. Maybe it is good news. Maybe it's just me, he said. He kept thinking out loud what the hell was going on with his brain as he massaged his scalp. His imagination tended to run rampant with daydreams anyway. It was a coping mechanism to squeeze some excitement to another typical day in the boring realms. He hoped that someday life might actually make more sense and be more exciting. But these troubles were not the kind of excitement he had in mind. This is all the government's fault, he yelled out loud to himself as a confused pedestrian walked by the bus stop and gave him a dirty look. He did have a reason to be angry. Cankerville's highway crew's failure to fix the roads had cost him thousands of dollars in underside repair because the road crews appeared to be too lazy to fix the streets. This repair was going to cost him $1,075, and now that he lost his job, he had the added challenge of trying to figure out how he's going to come up with the money. It was just as well, he reasoned. Without his car, he would have gotten fired anyway from delivering pizzas and anything else at Bonehead's. Hey man, got any change? Dixie looked up to see an older man with shoulders sloped over, matted greasy hair, weathered skin, and wearing jeans and an army coat, covered in a dirty white tee. Without warning, the man had just moseyed up to where Dixie had been sitting. Dixie was startled at his appearance. For although the man looked like someone from the haunted house district, the disheveled look he had didn't bother him so much as his eyes. When he looked into him, Dixie saw bright, clear blue pupils, harboring the most fatigued yet intense look Dixie had seen in his entire life. Look, I don't have any change, Dixie replied remorsefully. Just an extra bus pass. Uh-oh, bad idea. Still, Dixie looked at the vagabond and he felt helpless. He wished he could do more. His own life might existentially suck, but that was no reason why anyone else should struggle as Dixie seemed to be doing. Dixie picked up a window seat at the bus and set his bag on the open seat next to him. But that didn't stop the disheveled man from still sitting across the aisle. Wait, I know you, man, said the man. Don't I know you? The man's eyes narrowed as if he was trying to think. I saw you in a vision. At the mention of the word vision, Dixie could feel a slight anxiety attack come over him. They're looking for recruits to get up there, the man continued. Weather patterns are worse than you think. This isn't just about the second flood. Dixie didn't know what he meant. He sure wasn't exactly sure how to interact with such a man. The man wasn't dangerous, he just appeared odd. I didn't know what the hell I was doing, the man went on. Somebody should have instructed me. Someone has got to do it, though. Dixie stared at the man, speechless, as he kept babbling. As the bus made its way towards the spinach district, the disheveled man babbled all sorts of conspiracy theories that Dixie half listened to. Yeah, somewhere out there's a parallel universe where we didn't surf through all these problems, the man was saying. The economy's tanked right then and there. Yeah, the weak recovered, but the demodads are clever. The way I see it, they just waited their time once again, hiding in the shadows. Dixie wasn't listening. Normally he liked conspiracy theories, but he had already a lot on his mind. He kept staring out the window and wondering how he was going to explain the car bill to his parents and his failing grades. Yeah. Knowing the generations reset, they only need wait for gradients to get back online, the vagabond kept babbling. It's all part of the Master's Book of Game Strategy. Great. The bus had made a left turn to Uncle Tio Road and was about to enter the spinach district. Dixie was halfway home. The portals, my friend, the vagabond continued. He insisted again that he had come up from the north, barely escaping back to civilization. Of course, that was impossible. There was nothing up north but a barren, desolate wasteland, a Nakaland itself. But the old man went on. They'll be here. Somebody's got to. Somebody's got to do it. The man started getting more and more aggravated at his own words, and a look of anxiety overwhelmed the old man's face. I should have read it at the library before I took off, not just carry the extra weight. It's too late for me. But here, take it. As Dixie started finally paying more attention, the vagabond man babbled some other stuff that made the hairs on Dixie's neck stand up. Suddenly, without warning, the disheveled vagabond reached into his back pocket and pulled out a paperback book. It had been folded long ways and dog-eared. The cover was torn nearly off, but it had been reinforced with duct tape. Dixie didn't move. There was some sort of unforeseen aura about this man that commanded an intensity Dixie had never sensed before, and it really unnerved him. He was also confused. He had never met this guy before, and he didn't know why this man said he recognized him. Yeah, a vision came to me of giving this to someone today anyways, the vagabond old man continued. The bus stopped by Hicks Street by the spinach district, and the man dropped the book at Dixie's feet and then exited out the bus, muttering. As Dixie stared at the hobo-looking man through the window, the strange vagabond continued towards the corner of the block, looking around nervously, as if he was afraid he was being followed, and then suddenly he disappeared to the left. Boy, that was odd. Visions, weather patterns, Dixie whispered to himself. More like pure lunacy. It took Dixie a few moments to gather his wits. He found it hard to believe what had just happened. Of course, once again, up north would have meant Anakaland. It was a forsaken wasteland said to be a cross between the Bermuda Triangle, the Serengeti, and the surface of the moon. Fortunately, this phantom zone was comfortably separated from the boring realms he lived in by miles of desert and abandoned ghost towns. But the vagabond man had been adamant about his story. He seemed so delirious that Dixie knew he was much better off than this poor bastard. Dixie stared at the book by his feet. He could barely read the title. Esoteric Myths and Esoteric Places, Volume 3, Anakaland. A stamp inside the book jacket, right above the copyright notice, indicated that the man must have stolen it from the library. Dixie loved books on myths and far-off places, other planets, fictitious fantasy, and pretty much anything that let him escape reality. He thumbed through the contents. He never knew much about Anakaland, but decided to give it a try. Switching to a new window seat, Dixie slumped down, pulling the book to his chest and pressing his forehead against the cool glass. He was tired. He wished he could have helped the guy, actually. But that was odd. Looking through the glass, he could see the endless three-deckers and strip malls teetering off in all directions from every intersection. It appeared redundant and uninspirational, like a never-ending loop of background in a video game. Only here in the boring realms, Dixie muttered to himself. But at least this wasn't NWO country. This whole region had been able to survive the second flood. For good or bad, business had pretty much stayed the same around here. Suddenly, as Dixie stared out the window, his vision blurred, and it was as if he had stepped into another world. He could see himself scaling a great stone tower somewhere in the middle of nowhere under purple stellar sky. He studied the image in his mind. Suddenly, the image changed. He wasn't so much scaling the tower, but there were people above him that were scaling it, and he found himself in a strange thorny garden patch. The tower was on a patch of land suspended by nothing, and surrounded by a waterfall pouring into space between a surrounding ocean and a floating island. The name Pensepoli appeared in his mind. The whole scene was so vivid, and Dixie thought of the street wino, vagabond in his previous visions, and his heart began to race. Just then an ambulance siren blared nearby and startled him out of this reverie. The vision disappeared, and Dixie shook the cobwebs in his head as he watched the ambulance weave its way through the nearby traffic. I just need to sleep more, Dixie thought to himself. Finally, the bus pulled up near his home, and Dixie swung himself off the bench of the bus and shuffled quickly out the vehicle. Dixie spent the rest of the afternoon trying to relax while reading Esoteric Myths and Esoteric Places, Volume 3, Anakaland, in the comfort of his house. He thumbed through the contents and got excited. He never knew much about Anakaland other than the fact that it was a place that when he was a kid his parents simply told him to avoid at all costs. But the truth was, it was a welcome alternative to what he had been reading recently. An author named Clayton Jewett had founded bromance novels, a brand new genre in literature which skyrocketed this author to the bestseller list in bookstores everywhere. The books were poorly written trash, featuring groups of guys who were best friends, and Esoteric Myths was a stimulating read by comparison. Myths had some interesting stories about legends in the Northern District and fabled places believed to exist in Anakaland. Ironic that it was so close to proximity to the boring realms. According to this book, Esoteric Myths, the wastes of Anakaland up north was not the purgatory all the urban legends made it out to be. At the very least, it must have been a beautiful place very long ago. Dixie was fascinated by the passages he read about concerning the endless forests, the rolling river valleys, and all that greenery that supposedly wasn't supposed to exist up north. Because the area hadn't been stained by the swelling populations of human civilization, at least for the last 6,000 years according to the book, Anakaland held a taxonomy of creatures and wild animals like nowhere else in the world. According to the book, of course. And Esoteric Myths talked about some sort of thing called a multi-earth and a strange energy in the air there. Pure energy, untarnished by the pheromonic toxins of human living. According to the author, this yielded some superb abilities, quote, of health and vitality that simply do not exist anywhere else, unquote. There were also plenty of spaces that sounded pretty cool. Stuff straight out of fantasy books. If someone could read through the odd writing of Anakaland in this book, they could see that there are some very peculiar sounding valleys surrounding the slopes of Mount Mohadeo. And in theory, if somebody could survive not getting lost in the rolling hills beyond, according to this book, the trails out there by the mountain would eventually lead them to some place called Moam Cemetery. Evidently, this was a titanic graveyard that ran on practically forever. Somewhere beyond it was a place that led to an underworld. The same idea he had grown up hearing in all sorts of crackpot and urban legends that was called the Hollow Earths. Dixie snorted with a grin and shook his head, but he couldn't look away. I thought even the Nazis discredited this bunk, he muttered. As he kept thumbing through the pages, Dixie also read about a legend which sounded like something out of an old mariner's tale. Dixie read further and realized this must have been a reference to the fabled lost city of Kirkertown, a huge and ancient city allegedly built during the antediluvian era long ago. In many separate stories' mythologies, Kirkertown was always considered the capital fairy tale place for witness relocation in the ancient world. It became one of the legends tied with the 7 lost cities of gold. But the author of this book twisted this fable with a brand new theory of his own. The reason no one in hell would ever come looking for you there if you were a fugitive was simply because it was lost somewhere in Anakaland itself, somewhere west of Mount Muhadeo. Literally, Muhadeo, the very same one up north from the Boring Realms. And thus nobody in their right mind would want to make the perilous trip through the dark ether of unknown territory of Anakaland to get to this place. And according to esoteric myths, Kirkertown was quite modernized, if it was real, of course. And yet for some strange reason, no electromagnetic waves of any kind could penetrate its atmosphere. Scribbled on the side of a margin was a crudely written note that said, "The EMFs minimize natural viral infections that were not man-made there. Contagions of any kind. Hence the exosomes can tap into," but the next words were blurred out in a dark stain. Although Dixie couldn't comprehend it, his friend Mike Babayan would have appreciated that fact. Geophysicists had reported that within what was called the ionic Dyson sphere, it was possible for telecommunications to exist in short ranges in areas of Earth like that. It was believed the Bermuda Triangle, for instance, and the Devil's Sea had similar anomalies going on there. And at least this loophole in geophysics did justify the possibility the book's theory was possible, even if bloody unlikely. The author assured his readership that there were credible reports, and according to the scribbles on the margins, he quoted, "Credible reports that we have been fortunate enough to collect. They have been told by the few survivors who have explored Anakaland and lived to tell the tale." Unquote. It's a good thing I read this then, Dixie chuckled to himself. As for all the surrounding abandoned towns directly southwest of Anakaland, southwest of Mount Muhadeo in specifics, they were still equally as creepy and derelict. There were plenty of open roads to explore all along that region, for real. Highway 76 was once a very popular route to go cruising because it was connected to the southern ghost town surrounding Mount Muhadeo in Anakaland's border. And with the rest of the regions of the Boring Realms, it was probably the safest path to get between these two realities without getting yourself fully killed in the speed traps of Peepeety's Nice. In truth, all that Dixie really knew about these surrounding regions around Mount Muhadeo were the countless stories describing how haunted the whole district once known as Ziana was. It was his 8th grade teacher, actually, who had intrigued him to the geography of the lands of North, bordering Anakaland. And had it not been for books like Cryptic Tales from the Lost Files of Ziana, which had been written when his teacher was a kid and were designed to scare the daylight out of their readers, Dixie would have never known anything about the supposed history of all the abandoned towns to the northeast. All that was known was that once prosperous region had suddenly gotten conked out with electromagnetic interference anomalies and it had ruined the economy. But scientists could never fully explain the increasing cases of electrical dust storms. And in the end, it was the reports of paranormal activity that finally scared everyone off. As it stood now, Anakaland, as Mike Babayan had described the other day, was a vast desert waste with no further records available to investigate what was really up there. As Dixie continued reading about these fabled lands, he couldn't help but feel curious. Anakaland was one of the few places on Earth that modern cartographers had blotted out on a map as terra incognita, or too mysterious to travel, and the infamous speed traps of Peepeety's Nice was a terrible span of desert no man's land between the Boring Realms and Anakaland to the northwest. It had pretty much separated the two realms from each other in the same way a massive chasm separates two cliffsides. At least this book agreed with other myths that had been spoken about Anakaland. There was no truly safe passage to Anakaland by way of the speed traps. Within minutes, the rumored quicksands and sandstorms would cover entire caravans dumb enough to venture through. The waiver rock walls at the end of the desert would be impossible to scale. There was also a chapter dedicated to describing the gateway of the Great Gravity Door. Supposedly somewhere by the wastelands of Peepeety's Nice lay this thing called the Great Gravity Door, according to the book. Apparently it was sort of a warp zone between the speed traps and Anakaland that appeared out of nowhere along one solitary highway that cut through Peepeety's Nice. If this was all too strange to understand, it was because there were conflicting tales about what the Great Gravity Door really was. According to esoteric myths, this weird, almost extraterrestrial pit was the main reason trying to get to Anakaland in the first place was just a plain bad idea. Bermuda Triangle, Dixie scoffed. That's not credible. They said missing ships disappear simply due to the sheer volume of ships which pass through there. A few disappearing ships are bound to happen with that much flux of traffic, Dixie reasoned to himself as he thought about the strange phenomenon by the Florida Keys. At least that's what an adjunct geology professor had once told him. Huh. Dixie kept reading through this thing and just kept scoffing to himself. Who the hell wrote this thing anyway, he wondered out loud. He looked at the author's name and smirked. Sounds like a dentist. He actually checked the works cited for any references of these claims and found none. It seemed clear that the author, apparently one bloke by the name of Bit Passy, had lamely tried to paste together a history book or a travel guide of lost civilizations. It was plain this guy preferred crackpot conspiracy theories to rigorous empirical methods of research, but Dixie was loving the read. There were inscriptions written in the margins of some of the pages, too. More than he could count, actually. They were accompanied with plenty of sketches of medieval weaponry which looked ancient Mongolian. These clearly were not on the author's original print. The book also had a hand-drawn map, apparently made by someone claiming to have trotted around in Anakaland. But when Dixie reached page 233, he was so startled he dropped the book. It landed closed on the tips of his shoes. He could feel his heart beating fast. He nudged the book with a toe, then the other. He squinted at the book. Was this real? Hesitantly, Dixie picked up the book and opened again to page 233. There was the tower that he had seen in his vision on the bus. The Pensepoli Tower, complete with the floating island and the surrounding waterfall in space. How in the world did it end up as a sketch on the side of the margin? There were also some notes written on the next page. The words energy and tower waterfalls were written at the bottom. There were other bizarre symbols, but the smudging on the page didn't let him see exactly what they were. One odd ruin looked like the letter F pounding down on fire, but Dixie couldn't be sure what in the world it could mean. Beneath it was a smudged word written in English that said something like C, or maybe it was Kirkton. Kirkton, Dixie thought to himself. He couldn't tell for sure, but if he guessed correctly, it must have meant Kirkertown. The strange symbol in the middle seemed to have particular significance. There was an arrow pointing to it with carefully drawn characters. Unfortunately, these symbols resembled no human language Dixie was aware of, not even from anything he had found in his pseudoscience textbooks on ancient UFO mythology. Dixie squinted hard, trying to read through the smudged margins, but it was no good. The only other thing he could read right now, below the massive smudge, were the words, "Eyed of the Hive," and something about "only spirit matters." A few pages ahead on a margin, he could make out the words "Baal" and something about "it's not so much shifting, but tapping into a wavelength," the writing continued. But the rest of the writing was blurred. Dixie gawked, though, with astonishment. He felt like he was fighting deja vu. He excitedly thumbed more through the rest of the book, trying to find more scribble. He found some random notes written here and there all along the margins, but none made really sense. They were all written in those alien characters he had seen on page 234. He discovered the word circular void in English, with an arrow pointing towards something on page 339. But reading the text on that same page, there seemed to be no correlation to anything that explained circular void. Just a pleasant description of some giant ancient monuments believed to lie somewhere in Anakaland. The only other scribbles Dixie found written in English were at the very back of the book, a rant that seemed to be about modern life as far as Dixie could tell. Dixie found the whole thing somewhat unsettling. Mayan cycles of time coming, the writing went. The rat race has lied to us, once again. We're all tied down to find any significance in our own intrepidness. But there was such a massive stain on the page that there was no way to read what the whole diatribe was about. Rat race. Why does that sound so familiar? Dixie wondered. And then, of course, he remembered. Then there was something else about a portal. Went through the scribble read, followed by more smudge and the word portal and R seen again further down in the page. Dixie winced. This was starting to hurt his eyes. Maybe this was just the writing of the wino by the bus stop, he thought. He wished he had caught his name. But the only name outside of the printed work was handwritten in the back and side cover of the book jacket. Tapantha Dobson, 11/4, and the rest of the date was too smudged to figure out. Dixie took a deep breath, and he put the book down for a moment and stared out the window. There was something else smudged on the margins on the next page. Master Keys, the smudged, barely legible text was reading. And there was something else, some illegible words smudged after that. But Dixie thought it might have said, change parallel universe. Unfortunately, aside from some other description about a fabled territory found inside Anacaland, there was nothing in the text that helped clarify these notes. Jeez, I've got to find Chili and tell her about this, he thought, mystified. Were Dixie's own visions part of some bigger connection to all this stuff, or was it just coincidence? Dixie could feel the rational part of his mind wanting to take over, even though he felt so bored with life as it stood all around him. Dixie picked the book up again and continued to scan it, vigorously. Perhaps something else in the book could help explain something, anything, about his visions. He even called the Kinkinkerville Public Library to see if he could reserve the rest of the volume set for Exoteric Myths. Unfortunately, the librarian informed that the entire volume series had been stolen about 6 months ago from their archives. Even more frustrating, a quick online search showed that this series was out of print, and no copies could be found anywhere for sale anywhere. Then Dixie remembered that Chili was busy with one of her charity organizations tonight. He would have to wait.